She was lying on her back in the dirt when she gave the order. The ground beneath her was the color of rust and old blood, and the air above her pressed down with the kind of heat that doesn't ask permission. Her left hand was flat against her own side, fingers curled inward, holding a square of combat gauze against a wound she hadn't had time to properly address. Not life-threatening. Not yet. She had already done that math quickly, without sentiment, filed the answer, moved on. Her right hand held the radio. "Danny," she said. Her voice was level. Not calm the way people mean when they mean relaxed, calm, the way a bridge is calm. Load-bearing. "Danny, listen to me. You need to get your hand higher, above the level of his heart. Do it now." Static, then the sound of a young man trying very hard not to fall apart. "I don't, Doc, there's so much blood, I can't tell if I'm—" "You're doing it right," she said. "Stop thinking about the blood. Think about your hand. Keep pressure even. Don't pulse it, don't squeeze and release. Just hold, like you're holding something that matters." A pause. Rifle fire somewhere to the east. Someone else's problem for the next 90 seconds. "Okay," the voice said. "Okay, I got it." "Good. Don't let go." She pressed her own hand harder against her side and looked up at the sky. It was the early morning blue of a country where the sun comes up fast and without apology, a blue that wouldn't last long before it bleached to white. She had been in this specific situation for 47 minutes. 47 minutes of this mission, this day, this version of the life she had chosen. She thought about her father. Then she thought about what needed to happen in the next 4 minutes, and she got back on the radio. This is the story of Sarah Calloway. But to understand it, you have to start somewhere else. You have to start before the dirt and the blood in the radio. You have to start at a place that smelled of salt water and gun oil, where a group of men looked at a young woman and decided before she had spoken a single word that they already knew everything they needed to know about her. They were wrong about almost all of it. Some of them would spend the rest of their careers thinking about the specific morning they realized it. Naval Base Coronado sits on a thin peninsula between San Diego Bay and the Pacific Ocean, and in the early hours it belongs to a purposeful quiet. Not peaceful, the Navy doesn't traffic in peaceful exactly, but intentional. The quiet of people who know what they're doing and have done it long enough to stop narrating it. Gulls working the shoreline, a vessel groaning somewhere in the bay, boots on pavement in a rhythm so deeply embedded in muscle memory that it barely registered as sound. Sarah Calloway arrived by taxi. This was the first thing they noticed. Not her face, not her size, not how she moved the taxi. A civilian cab pulling up to the main gate of one of the most restricted naval installations in the country, a young woman stepping out with a green duffel over one shoulder and a medical kit that had been through more than most people's passports. The gate guard asked for her identification twice. The second time, he called someone. A different someone arrived, checked the same identification, and walked her through with the manner of a man not entirely certain he was doing the right thing. She was 28 years old, 5 feet 4 inches, 120 pounds in her boots. Dark brown hair pulled back and secured, not styled, solved. Her eyes were a shade of blue that looked gray in certain light, and in that morning light they looked like the water in the bay. Still on the surface, moving underneath. She had a scar on her left forearm, thin and pale, running 3 inches along the inner wrist. Old. Surgical if you knew what to look for. Most people didn't. Senior Chief Marcus Holloway knew what surgical scars looked like. He'd seen enough of them in enough places. But that wasn't what he was thinking when he looked at her. What he was thinking was, this is a mistake. The briefing room at Team 8's compound had no interest in impressing anyone. Drop ceiling, fluorescent light, a table long enough for 12 currently occupied by 6 men who had accumulated between them more than a century and a half of special operations experience. A whiteboard on one wall, a map of northern Iraq on the other, with markings that would have been classified above the level of most government officials. Lieutenant Commander Garrett Renwick stood at the head of the table. 44 years old, with a face that had been lived in rather than merely aged lines from squinting into wind, a jaw that had been clenched against things worth clenching against. He held a manila folder and was looking at it the way a man looks at something that doesn't add up. Stone Senior Chief Holloway, to anyone who hadn't known him long enough to drop it, was 46 and built like something quarried rather than grown. He sat with his forearms on the table, a posture that looked relaxed and wasn't. He'd been in special operations since before some of the younger men in the room had started high school, and he had the stillness of a man who has learned that the most dangerous thing in any room is often the thing that isn't moving. Chief Ray Dunbar Ghost, by reputation and by practice, occupied the far end of the table, with the quiet authority of a man who understands that the best position in any room is the one that lets you see everything while drawing no attention to yourself. 41 years old, lean in the way serious endurance produces, with dark eyes that moved in small regular patterns across the room, even in situations that required no tactical awareness. It was involuntary. He'd stopped trying to stop it years ago. Danny Beckett was 29 on his third deployment cycle, with the energy of a man who was good at his job and knew it without being entirely certain he had been tested enough to be sure. He sat straight, not confidence attention. He was paying the latter. Colt Stover was 24, the newest member of the team, trying hard not to look like it, succeeding at about 60%, which in that room was not enough. They all looked at Sarah Calloway when she came through the door. She set her duffel beside the entrance and her medical kit on the table, and she opened the kit and began checking its contents. Not performing the check, doing it working left to right through each compartment with the attention of someone who understood that a missed item could not be solved later. She did not introduce herself. She did not look up. Stone watched her for 4 seconds. By his standards, generous. Can you even hold a scalpel without shaking Doc? She didn't look at him. She moved from the hemostatic gauze to the tourniquet pouch, confirmed the cat was properly wound, and accessible, set it back. I'll take that as a no, Stone said. Renwick set down the folder. Senior Chief. Sir. Stone's tone made clear he'd said what he meant and had no interest in taking it back. Renwick looked at Sarah. Dr. Calloway, I've been given your file. He chose the next word deliberately. Brief. She closed the kit and looked up for the first time, and what Renwick saw in her face was neither defensiveness nor apology. It was the direct attention of someone who had already measured the situation and arrived at a conclusion. The rest is above your clearance level, Lieutenant Commander. What you need to know is that I've been attached to your team by request of Naval Special Warfare Command, and I will do my job. I'd appreciate the opportunity to do it without additional obstacles. The room was quiet for a moment. Ghost at the far end of the table did not change his expression, but his eyes moved to Stone, then to Sarah, and something in them shifted in a way no one else caught. Stone's jaw tightened. With respect, ma'am, the obstacles in this room have 60 years of combined combat experience, and the last thing we need on a Tier 1 operation is Stone. Renwick said it once flat. That was enough. Stone sat back. He looked at the map. His hands on the table remained loose, but there was something different in the stillness, the quality of a man who has decided to wait rather than continue. Renwick ran the briefing. The mission parameters were straightforward on the surface. A compound in the Nineveh Plains of northern Iraq, 40 kilometers southwest of Mosul. Satellite imagery showed a structure that had changed hands twice in 3 years, abandoned then occupied by a small armed group, with connections the imagery couldn't confirm. Inside, according to intelligence, verified through 3 separate channels, was a man, an asset, someone whose information was worth the risk of sending 6 operators and 1 civilian contractor, medic, into a location the United States government would officially deny any knowledge of. The medic requirement was specific to the asset's condition. Nearly a year in captivity, physical state unknown. The extraction needed someone capable of field assessment and stabilization, and potentially something beyond that. Renwick did not explain why that someone had arrived in a taxi. Sarah asked about prevailing wind direction at the target location and projected nighttime temperature for the extraction window. Both medically relevant wind direction mattered if there was chemical contamination risk, and temperature affected how quickly a malnourished patient in poor condition could lose core body heat during extraction. Renwick answered. Ghost wrote something in the small notebook he kept in his left breast pocket. Stone stared at the map and said nothing. After the briefing, the team moved to the training range for the afternoon qualification block. Sarah was not expected to participate. She was there to observe, to understand the team's movement patterns and communication styles before she would be embedded with them. She stood off to one side with her kit and watched. Ghost noticed the way she watched. Most observers looked for spectacle. Sarah watched the way someone runs calculations. Her eyes moved to terrain features before they moved to people. She tracked gaps between team members, angles, sight lines. When Stover moved wide on a clearing drill and left a gap in coverage that Renwick quietly corrected afterward, her chin dropped slightly, a small nod, as if she'd already marked the error before Renwick spoke. Ghost filed this away. The heat built in the early afternoon the way it does on the Southern California coast. Not the brutal direct heat of the desert, but thick and pressing, catching people who weren't paying attention. Danny Beckett was paying attention to the wrong things. He'd been running dry on hydration all morning. Third cycle back from deployment rotation picked up the habit of testing his limits in training. He knew it wasn't smart. Experience had convinced him that knowing something was the same as being exempt from it. It isn't. He went down at 1,400 hours, dropping from standing to one knee in a way that looked controlled until it very quickly wasn't. The team corpsman was at his side in seconds. Heat exhaustion, he assessed. Standard protocol, shade fluids rest. He reached for his pack. Sarah was already there. She was not reaching for fluids. She looked at Beckett's eyes, tilted his chin, checked his pupils, both sides, not just one, which separates someone who learned the protocol from someone who understands the reason for it. 2 fingers to his wrist, counting. She pressed her thumb against the inside of his forearm and watched the color return, or rather, watched it not return the way it should. "This isn't heat exhaustion," she said. The corpsman looked at her. "Ma'am, the presentation is consistent with his skin is dry." She stated it as a fact, not subject to interpretation. Core temperature, presentation, dry skin, altered baseline. He's not sweating enough to be exhausted. He's not sweating at all. That's heat stroke. Grade 3. Aggressive cooling in the next 4 minutes. The specific beat of institutional hesitation the moment trained personnel process information from an unexpected source. Stone said, "She's not." "Do it," Renwick said. They did. Sarah directed the process with the economy of someone who had run this intervention enough times that the words came automatically. Ice packs to the axilla, neck, groin, the major vascular points where cooling reaches the bloodstream fastest. Position him correctly. No oral fluids until cognition fully clears. Aspiration risk with a confused patient is not worth it. Keep talking to him, not for comfort, because the quality of his verbal responses tells you what his brain is doing. 4 minutes later, Danny Beckett's eyes were tracking clearly, and he was complaining about the ice packs. In emergency medicine, this is an excellent sign. People well enough to complain about their treatment are generally well enough to survive it. Renwick was looking at Sarah with the expression of a man revising an estimate. Stone was looking at the ground near his boots. His expression was difficult to read, which meant it was doing considerable work beneath the surface. Ghost remained in position. He was watching Sarah finish her assessment, the final check, the confirmation she was satisfied with. Beckett's stabilization, the small, deliberate pause before she stood that looked like stillness, but was actually the last data point of a continuous evaluation. He had worked with a lot of medical personnel in the field. He had never seen one who ran the physical assessment and the environmental threat assessment, simultaneously treating them as parts of the same problem rather than separate priorities. The notebook in his left breast pocket had another entry. Renwick pulled Sarah aside after Beckett was comfortable and stable, sitting in the shade with a hydration pack and a level of chagrin that only comes from being saved by someone you weren't prepared to need. Renwick had the folder again. He opened it and looked at the second page. He read the name of the medical school. He read the enrollment date and the expected completion date. He closed the folder. "Johns Hopkins," he said. "Yes." "Surgical residency, trauma specialty." "Yes." He was quiet. Outside the range, the Pacific moved against the sand with its slow, indifferent rhythm. "They didn't send us a medic." "No," Sarah said. "They sent you what you needed. You just didn't know what that was yet." He held her gaze for a long moment. "Your file mentions a field rotation with Médecins SF, Médecins Sans Frontières." "I did a rotation, yes." "Where?" A pause, small but present. "Kandahar." He nodded. He didn't press. The file's final section was blacked out entirely, not withheld from him specifically, but from everyone at his clearance level, which covered most things worth covering. "The team has reservations," he said. "I know. Stone in particular." She said nothing. He noticed this specifically, that she didn't offer the response most people would offer. Some version of reassurance. Some form of auditioning for acceptance. She held his gaze and let the statement sit, already addressed by everything that had happened in the past hour. "Wheels up at 0300, Renwick said. "Get some rest, Dr. Calloway." "Yes, sir." She picked up her kit and walked toward the barracks. Renwick watched her go, then looked across the compound to where Stone was checking equipment near the vehicle bay, back to both of them, his movements carrying the controlled force of a man keeping his opinions to himself. Renwick had worked with Stone for 11 years. He knew the difference between Stone's silences. This one was not acceptance, but it was not refusal either. It was the silence of a man who had recognized something and hadn't yet decided what to do with it. The armory was organized the way serious practitioners organize their tools, every item in a specific place for a specific reason, the system having evolved through years of operational necessity into something that looked almost intuitive once you understood its logic. Stone was in there at 1900 hours working through pre-mission maintenance with the focused attention of a man who finds repetitive work quieting in ways that other things aren't. He was cleaning the Barrett M82A1 when Sarah walked past. She was heading to the adjacent equipment room needed to draw her field kit and confirm it was fully stocked. The doorway between the two rooms was open. She walked past it, and he was aware of her, the way he was aware of everything that moved within a certain radius. Not consciously, just registered, cataloged, filed. Then he heard her stop. He looked up. She was in the doorway. Not looking at him, looking at the Barrett on the workbench. Her left hand had moved without her apparently knowing it, fingers extending slightly toward the weapon and then curling back. The gesture of a hand that had reached for something and caught itself. It lasted under 2 seconds. She looked away, tucked the hand into her jacket pocket, and continued into the equipment room. Stone set down the cleaning rod and looked at the empty doorway. He had been a firearms instructor for 4 years before operational tempo made that role untenable. In that time, he had learned that the hand tells you things the face tries to hide. He had watched thousands of people handle weapons, and he had learned to read the relationship between a person and a firearm in the first moment of contact, not the technical quality of the grip, but the nature of the familiarity. Whether the weight was expected or surprising. Whether the reach was calculated or remembered. The hand that had moved in that doorway was reaching for something it already knew. He put that away. He returned to the Barrett and the cleaning rod and the grounding work of maintenance. But the thing he'd put away did not stay still. It sat in the back of his mind with the patience of something that intended to be retrieved. Later in the hour before midnight, Sarah sat on the steps outside the barracks and looked toward the range. The Pacific was invisible beyond the tree line except for the sound of it, and the range was empty, and the distances between things that would matter tomorrow were measurements she was running in her head without quite meaning to. She looked at her father's watch. Military issue, the crystal scratched in 3 places, the band replaced twice. Still keeping time after nearly 2 decades. The kind of object that outlasts the person who owned it and then spends the rest of its existence being a problem for the people who loved them. She thought about the morning he put it on her wrist. She had been 10 years old, and the watch sat at her elbow, not her wrist, because her wrist was too small. He had laughed, not performed, not for her benefit, just a man finding something genuinely funny in a moment that was also serious. He tightened the band to its last notch and said it would fit someday, and she had believed him the way children believe things adults say with confidence. She thought about her mother, the last real conversation, not the last conversation, but the last one that carried the weight of finality in it, the kind you recognize afterward when you understand that the person was already knowing something you weren't. Her mother in the hospital chair, thinner than October, holding Sarah's hand with a grip stronger than it looked. Not asking her to stop being who she was, just asking her to stop one specific thing. The guns, she had said. Your father gave you something beautiful, and I know that. But every time I see you with one, I see him. And I can't. She hadn't finished the sentence. She hadn't needed to. Sarah had promised. She had kept that promise for 3 years through medical school and residency, and the field rotation in Kandahar, and everything that had happened there. She had kept it until tonight when she was about to board a military transport and go somewhere the promise would either hold or it wouldn't. She had not yet resolved which of those outcomes she was prepared for. She thought about what her father said at the bench in the field behind their house in Virginia, before every session, before every round. Steady hands, Sarah. Both of them. Let everything else move and keep your hands still. She had understood it as shooting instruction for 11 years. She was beginning to understand it as something else. 3 hours later, the team gathered for the final pre-mission check. Gear confirmation, communication frequencies, exfil coordinates, contingency protocols. The things you say when you've already thought through everything you can think through, and now you're saying them again because saying them is part of the preparation. Sarah sat at the table's end and listened. Stone stood across the room. He looked at her once, one long look carrying more than it delivered, and then at the map. Ghost near the door watched this exchange. Renwick ran the final brief. Wheels up in 40 minutes. HAHO insertion from 23,000 feet. Target window 0430 local. The asset was in the building. The intelligence was verified. In extract, the asset out before sunrise. Any questions? Stone looked at Sarah again. Not the same look as before. Shorter, different cargo. He wasn't assessing her anymore. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a problem he hasn't finished solving. She met his gaze. She held it exactly long enough to communicate that she understood she was being looked at and found it neither threatening nor interesting. Stone looked away first. No questions. 40 minutes later, the C-130 was moving. And somewhere over the eastern Atlantic, Sarah Calloway sat in the red-lit darkness of the cargo bay, with her kit between her knees and her father's watch on her wrist, and she was the only person on that aircraft who knew every layer of what they were flying toward. The jump altitude was 23,000 feet, and at that height, the world below looks less like a place where things happen to people and more like a diagram of where they might. Abstract. Geometrical. The Nineveh plains at 4 in the morning, viewed through the open ramp door, were darkness interrupted by the occasional scatter of lights, marking settlements, roads, the presence of people who were almost certainly asleep and had no awareness of the aircraft overhead or the 6 people about to leave it. Sarah stood in the line with her parachute harness fitted and checked and double-checked, and she breathed the way she had learned to breathe before procedures that required everything she had. Not slowly, not deeply. That's a misconception from meditation classes that has nothing to do with functional oxygen management under stress. She breathed normally. She let her body do what it knew how to do. She focused on the thing directly in front of her, which was the back of Beckett's parachute pack, and she let everything else occupy exactly as much of her attention as it needed to, and no more charm. Stone was behind her. She couldn't see him, but she was aware of his presence the way you're aware of something large and deliberate that has chosen to remain still. He had not spoken to her since the briefing room. The jump master's signal came without ceremony. One by one they went out into the dark. The cold at that altitude is not a temperature so much as a physical fact, a condition the body processes not as sensation but as information, a signal that the environment is outside normal parameters and that resources should be allocated accordingly. Sarah had jumped twice before in controlled training environments with forgiving weather. She knew HAHO theory with the precision of someone who had studied it rather than the fluency of someone who had practiced it. There was a difference between those two things that only open air can demonstrate. The canopy opened and the world reorganized around her. Below the plains, to the north, a faint smear of ambient light from Mosul. Above her, stars thick enough to give the sky more substance than the land beneath it. She found her bearings, found the team's lights below and to her left, adjusted. The glide path was long. The point of a high-altitude jump with an early canopy deployment is the distance it buys the ability to cross kilometers of potentially observed terrain without the noise of a low-altitude insertion. 12 minutes of flight. She used 11 of them to breathe and 1 to think about what came next. The landing was hard and she rolled it coming up already moving, pulling the canopy down against her chest to reduce her signature. Around her, the team materialized from the dark, each executing the same sequence, with the efficiency of people for whom this is stored somewhere below conscious thought. Renwick was already moving, Ghost on his left. Stone fell in behind Beckett. Stover completed the rear. Sarah took her position and moved. The compound was 4 kilometers northeast across terrain. The satellite imagery had described as relatively open with occasional drainage channels and sparse vegetation. The imagery was accurate. The ground was harder than it looked from above sun-baked clay that had compressed itself into something near concrete over the dry months, holding the cold in its surface the way tile does. They moved in the managed silence of people who have turned noise reduction into practice. Wind across the plain, the distant percussion of something mechanical toward the northern road. 6 sets of boots on hard earth, reduced to something barely above nothing. Ghost was on point. Renwick behind him. Sarah had a clear enough view of both to understand something about the way Renwick trusted Ghost's instincts. There was communication happening between them in small hand signals and micro-adjustments that had the quality of a language long spoken between people who had shared enough of situations to stop explaining things. She cataloged this. She was building a picture of the team's internal grammar, the specific ways they communicated when communication had to compress to gesture and positioning. It would matter in the next hour. She was certain of this the way she was certain of things she couldn't fully articulate. A clinical instinct built from years of reading rooms and people the way a medic has to read them quickly and without the luxury of asking questions. They crossed the final kilometer in 11 minutes and settled into the shadow of a drainage channel along the compound's eastern perimeter. The compound was single-story reinforced concrete block built during a period of administrative expansion in the early 2000s and repurposed several times since. The satellite imagery had shown 2 vehicles outside the eastern entrance and a regular pattern of movement at the access points, suggesting 4 to 8 personnel. Renwick deployed the team into observation positions. Ghost and Stone went wide on the northern approach. Beckett and Stover took the southern angle. Renwick held center with Sarah beside him, both flat against the inner wall of the channel. Sarah was not running the tactical picture. She was mapping the building the way a surgeon maps an operating theater, before cutting every exit, every choke point, every place where something could go wrong, and what the options would be when it did. Where the windows were. What the access points looked like from an emergency extraction standpoint. Which walls were load-bearing. Renwick touched her arm once. She followed his sight line, the Eastern Guard position. 2 personnel moving in an irregular pattern, habitual rather than formal protocol. Irregular patterns are sometimes harder to predict than formal ones, but they're more likely to have gaps. Ghost's voice through the earpiece, barely above breath. North clear, 1 personnel, static elevation. Elevation. She processed this. Stone's response was a single click of the transmit button. Acknowledgement. After long enough together, the vocabulary of single transmit clicks expands to cover a significant number of common responses. Renwick gave the signal. The team compressed toward the entry points. The next 4 minutes had the compressed time quality of operational movement, everything happening faster than it should be possible, and simultaneously stretching each moment, containing more information than normal moments allow. Stone and Ghost came in from the north and addressed the entry personnel with the quiet efficiency of practiced art. Beckett and Stover covered the south. Renwick and Sarah moved through the primary entrance on a 3 count. Inside was darker than outside. The night vision turned everything to shaded geometry, walls and doorways, the angles of a floor plan Renwick had memorized until it became spatial intuition. Sarah stayed close enough to read his movement cues without needing to see his hands. They were 30 seconds from the target room when the shot came. From above and outside from the elevation, Ghost had flagged a rooftop on the northern side of a secondary structure beyond the imagery frame, not inside the compound. Outside it, in a position the satellite coverage had not included, and the ground surveillance had not detected until the moment it became impossible not to detect, because Ghost Dunbar was on the ground and his earpiece was transmitting static. Renwick said 1 word into the radio, and the team's response was immediate compression to cover positions. Beckett and Stover pulling back to the southern wall, Stone moving without being told to a position with line of sight on the northern approach. Sarah was already moving toward Ghost. He was down in the open ground between the drainage channel and the compound's northern wall, 8 meters of nothing. He had fallen controlled, which meant he'd been conscious going down, and he was moving, which meant he still was. But the movement was compromised in the specific way of someone managing severe pain while trying to suppress the evidence of it. She covered the 8 meters. Round through the left shoulder, entered from above and right, which told her something about the shooter's position and angle, exited cleanly through the trapezius muscle without hitting the joint. Serious, not immediately fatal. The distinction mattered. She got her hands on him and got him moving, not dragging, supporting, applying direct pressure to the exit wound with her right hand while using her left to guide his movement toward the relative cover of the drainage channel. He was helping her. It was costing him considerably, and he did it without audible complaint. Back in the channel, she opened her kit. Renwick's voice in the earpiece. The shooter was still in position. Ghost's wound established the approximate location rooftop of the secondary structure, northern side approximately 7 meters above ground level. Distance from the compound's northern wall, 820 meters, give or take her estimation of the secondary structure's position. She was packing the entry wound with hemostatic gauze, and Ghost was watching her do it with the focused attention of a man who finds it easier to concentrate on being treated than on being shot. And she heard Renwick go through the team's capabilities on the radio. Stone's position didn't have the angle. Beckett was pinned. Stover didn't have the reach with his optics at that distance. Anyone have a clean line from the eastern side of the channel? Silence. She applied a pressure dressing over the packed wound secured. It moved to the tourniquet kit for the secondary bleed on the inside of his upper arm, a fragment wound actively bleeding. 820 meters. She had been doing this calculation since Ghost said elevation. Her mind had gone there on its own, the way that went places, sometimes without being sent. Sir, she kept her voice level. Permission to attempt a shot from the eastern end of the channel. I have a partial angle from there. 2 seconds of silence. 2 seconds is a significant amount of time to spend not responding in this kind of situation. Stone said, "Are you serious right now?" It wasn't phrased as a question. She didn't respond to Stone. She looked at Renwick. He was running a decision tree at speed. The only way decision trees run when what you have is not a good option and a bad option, but two different bad options. The team had one sniper-capable rifle, the Barrett M8 2A1 that Stone had pre-staged in the second vehicle's cargo area before their departure, broken down into a hard case that looked like equipment accessible in under 40 seconds. He had staged it there, not because it was in the mission profile, but because this kind of ground-dense urban transit, short sight lines, unpredictable geometry, was exactly the kind of environment where having a long-range capability and not needing it was preferable to the alternative. The team had no one in a position to use it effectively. She watched Renwick complete the calculation. He moved the Barrett to her position with two words: "Do it." She had not held a rifle in 3 years. This is the kind of statement that requires clarification because 3 years might suggest that she had forgotten things that the specific physical knowledge, degrading over time, would show up now in this moment as a deficit. But the things the body learns young are stored differently from the things the mind learns later. They don't fade the same way. They wait. They sit in the hands and the shoulders and the particular geometry of the spine when settling behind a scope. And when the conditions are right, they are there before the conscious mind has finished asking for them. She brought the Barrett up, and the weight of it was exactly what she expected. Not because she had calculated the weight from specifications, though she knew them, had known them since her father walked her through every component of every weapon he considered worth teaching, but because her hands had held this weight before. Enough times that the adjustment was instantaneous. Her left hand found a grip under the stock. Her right settled around the pistol grip, and her trigger finger aligned outside the guard before she had consciously decided to put it there. She settled into the bipod. She looked through the scope. The rooftop materialized in the glass, the northern structure elevated 7 meters a man, in prone position, behind an improvised rest of sandbags and a wooden pallet. He was scanning. He hadn't identified her position in the channel yet. She breathed, her father's voice. Not heard exactly, more like a quality that arrived in her hands. The bench behind the house. The cedar planks he'd built himself, repainted every spring because he said things worth keeping were worth maintaining. Steady hands, Sarah. Both of them. Let everything else move. She felt her mother's hand on hers in the hospital chair. The gun, she had said. She felt the weight of the promise. She calculated the wind. The air was moving from the northwest at approximately 8 knots. She had registered this on the approach, cataloged it automatically. At 820 meters, 8 knots of crosswind required a hold of approximately 18 inches depending on bullet weight and velocity. She adjusted her hold. She set her breathing. She let her heart rate drop. She squeezed the trigger. The Barrett's recoil was absolute, 30 pounds of rifle absorbing the force of a round capable of penetrating light vehicle armor, and the impulse moved through her shoulder as a fact of physics that the body received without interpretation. The round hit 4 inches right of the target. Wind shift, brief, maybe 2 seconds coming, just before the round reached its destination. A quarter knot change at the wrong moment. Enough. She didn't reset visibly. She didn't move her head. She read what the round's impact told her about the actual wind behavior, at distance adjusted, and did all of this in approximately 3 seconds without looking away from the scope. The man on the rooftop had identified the shot's direction. He was moving to reorient. She squeezed the trigger again. He stopped moving. She held the position for 5 seconds. She verified. Then she lowered the rifle and turned back to Ghost, who had watched the entire sequence from 2 feet away with the expression of a man encountering something he does not have an immediate category for. "How are you feeling?" she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then, "Better than he is." She nodded once. She checked his dressing. Renwick's voice in the earpiece moved up. They brought the asset out 14 minutes later, severely malnourished, dehydrated, multiple minor injuries consistent with prolonged captivity, fully lucid. The first thing he said when he saw Renwick was in English and contained information Renwick listened to with the focus of someone receiving something that would require a great deal of thought to process. Sarah was not listening to that conversation. She was assessing the asset's physical condition, calculating what he needed and in what order. When she determined he was stable enough for movement, she said so, and they moved. The exfil point was 2 kilometers south. They covered it in 31 minutes. Stone did not say anything for the first 22 of those minutes. Every member of the team was aware of this on some level because Stone's silence in motion was categorically different from Stone's silence at rest. What surrounded them during those 22 minutes was not the silence of a man with nothing to say, but the silence of a man deciding what to say and how. At the 23rd minute, staged in a drainage feature, 300 meters from the exfil point, Stone moved to a position 2 meters from Sarah. He was looking north. He did not turn when he spoke. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Not a question. The end of something, the final word of a sentence that had been starting and stopping for 22 minutes. "My father," she said. He was quiet. The wind pushed from the northwest a little stronger, now moving in long, invisible currents across the plain. "What was his name?" Renwick, 2 meters to her other side, had gone still. He was not indicating that he was listening. He was absolutely listening. "William Calloway," she said. "Gunnery sergeant. Battalion 1st Marines." The silence that followed had a different structure from the previous silences. It contained something. She watched Stone's back. He had not moved. His hands were on his rifle in the position of someone maintaining readiness, and they had not shifted. But something changed in the set of his shoulders, a change so small it would have been invisible to anyone not watching for it, and she had been watching for it. Ghost was 2 meters to her left. She had been monitoring his color and breathing with the peripheral attention she kept running on patience. She saw him close his eyes, not a blink, a close. The close of someone who has been waiting for something to arrive and has just heard it come through the door. Renwick's earpiece produced the confirmation signal. They moved. The MH-60M came in low and fast. The door opened before the skids touched the crew chief, moving toward the assassin, before Stone had cleared the rotor wash. They loaded. The aircraft climbed. At altitude with the door closed, the team occupied the cramped cargo bay in the arrangement of people who are exhausted, but not yet safe enough to stop being alert. The asset was secured and receiving fluids from the IV Sarah had established during the run to the exfil point. Ghost sat beside her shoulder, immobilized, the dressing clean and holding his face, carrying the careful blankness of a man managing pain he has decided is acceptable. Beckett sat across from Sarah. He had not spoken since the compound. He was looking at her with the expression she had learned to recognize on patients who have been through something significant and are still determining what exactly it was. Stover was looking out the small window. Whatever he was seeing, it wasn't outside. Stone sat at the far end of the cargo bay, back against the interior wall, looking at the middle distance. He had been in this position since they loaded. He had not looked at Sarah once. She watched him for a moment. Then she returned to Ghost's dressing. The aircraft crossed into Kurdish airspace. The crew chief passed the information through a hand signal Renwick acknowledged. Below, the Nineveh plains gave way to rougher terrain preceding the mountains, and the light in the east had begun its shift from black to the deep blue that arrives 20 minutes before sunrise. Renwick crossed to Stone's position and sat beside him. The two men exchanged the brief, coded communication of people who have operated together long enough that their conversations have become mostly internal. Then Renwick looked across the cargo bay at Sarah. "Dr. Calloway." She looked up. "Good shooting tonight." She held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you, sir." He nodded, then both shots. She understood what he meant. He meant the first one too, the one that missed, in the 3 seconds between the miss and the correction. He was telling her he had been watching not the outcome, but the process, and what he saw was not luck. She returned to Ghost's arm. Stone said nothing, but his hands, loose on his rifle since they loaded, were no longer loose. They were clasped, tight in the way of someone keeping something contained. The aircraft descended toward Erbil 40 minutes later. They landed. The asset was transferred to a waiting medical team. Ghost was walked to the medical bay by Sarah and a base corpsman. She stayed long enough to ensure the handoff included a full accounting of everything she had done and found and assessed, because the quality of information you pass forward is as important as the quality of treatment you deliver. She had learned this before she had learned most other things. When she came back out, the team was at the vehicle staging area, and Stone was sitting on a concrete block in the shade of the vehicle bay wall, elbows on his knees, hands between them, looking at the floor. The same posture as the equipment room the night before, but the thing he was running through was not the same thing, and the expression on his face, which he was not managing, which was unusual for him, was not the same expression. She could have walked past, she had reasons to. A kit to restock notes, to write a dozen small tasks that would legitimately occupy her if she chose to let them. She sat down 4 feet from him. He didn't look at her. "You were there," she said. Not a question. He looked at his hands. "Fallujah, November 2004. His voice had lost the texture she'd known it to have, the roughness that served as a kind of armor, the volume that took up space. What was left was quieter and more direct. "3rd Battalion 1st Marines, your father's unit." She said nothing. "I was attached," he said. Navy SEAL element embedded with the Marine unit for the push through the Jolin district, November 8th through the 14th. He stopped. The sound of a generator somewhere on the other side of the compound filled the space where words might have been. He was in the second stick. We were clearing a block in the northern sector, and we took fire from an elevated position, second floor of a building that had been marked clear. It wasn't clear. He stopped again. He got between it and two other men. He made a decision in less time than it takes to describe the decision, and he went toward the fire instead of away from it. She was looking at the side of his face. He was still looking at his hands. One of those men, he said, and the weight in how he said it told her where the sentence was going before it arrived, was me. The generator. Traffic on the base road. A helicopter somewhere distant on approach. I couldn't get to him in time, Stone said. He was down in 4 seconds. I ran the angle and tried and was too far to close the distance before he went down. There was nothing I could do for him. He unclenched his hands and turned them over, looking at the palms in the way of a man doing an accounting. What I could do, the only thing, was pull him out, get him clear of the structure before the fire spread, so his family could bury him right. He looked up for the first time and looked at her directly. I know his name, he said. I've known it for nearly 20 years. I wrote to your mother. Twice. She wrote back once. He stopped. His jaw worked against something. She was a good woman. She was, Sarah said. I should have said something. When you walked in, I should have told you. You didn't know, she said. I knew before the end of the briefing. When you checked your kit like that, same order left to right, nothing moved on. He used to do the same thing. He said it once, anything worth carrying is worth carrying right. She was quiet for a moment. He said that to me too, she said. This sat between them the way shared things sit approached from different angles by different people, carrying different pieces of the same original weight. Stone looked out across the compound. His voice shifted again. Not the quiet of what he'd just said, but something further back behind it, something that had been sitting there through the whole conversation. You knew, he said, not quite an accusation, more like a man arriving at a conclusion he hadn't been looking for. When you came into Coronado, you already knew. She held his gaze. Yes. He processed this. He moved through things completely, which took longer than moving through them quickly and produced different results. You put in for this team, he said. Yes. Because I was on it. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment. The expression on his face was doing more than one thing at once, grief and something adjacent to relief and something further that didn't have a clean name, but that she recognized because she had been carrying the same thing from a different direction. Why, he said, she had thought about how to answer this for months in the abstract, in the time between reading his name in a declassified after-action summary and walking into the briefing room at Coronado. She had thought about it on the C-130. She had not arrived at a single clean answer because single clean answers were usually the simplified version of something more complicated. Because he saved 2 men, she said, and one of them is still here, and I wanted to know what that meant. Stone did not respond immediately. He sat with this the way he sat with things fully without apparent hurry, as if what arrived at the end of the consideration was worth the time it took to get there. And, he said, I don't know yet, she said. I think I needed to be in the same room with you to figure it out. He was quiet for a while. Then you're a hell of a shot. The simplest sentence he had said to her and the most complete, and it was carrying more than it said the way significant things usually do. He taught me, she said. Stone nodded, once slowly. Yeah, he said. He would have. Renwick appeared at the edge of the vehicle bay. He took in the 2 of them on the concrete block, its absence of hostility in the space between them, and whatever he made of it, he kept on his own side of the distance. Debrief in 20, he said, and both of you. He disappeared. Stone stood. He looked down at her for a moment. There's more, she said. She was still sitting, looking up at him without apology. Something else you don't know yet. He met her eyes. Tell me, he said. She shook her head. Not yet. When the time is right. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he nodded a small, singular acknowledgement and walked toward the building. She sat on the concrete block for another moment. She looked at the wall of the vehicle bay, the color of everything here, sand and sun, and the gray of concrete that has been outdoors a long time. She breathed the way she breathed before things that required everything she had. Then she stood up and followed him inside. The debrief lasted 40 minutes and produced more questions than it answered, which is the nature of debriefs when the ground has diverged from the plan in ways that matter. Renwick ran it. Sarah sat at the table's end with a notebook she wrote in only occasionally in shorthand that looked like nothing to anyone who hadn't developed it themselves. Stone sat across from her and did not look at her directly, which was not the same as not being aware of her. Ghost was in the medical bay, his shoulder being addressed by a base surgeon who had communicated through the corpsman that Sarah's fieldwork had been exactly right, and the joint was intact and the prognosis was good. What Renwick told them now in the debrief room with its one window and its smell of concrete and institutional coffee was that the asset was not simply an intelligence source. He was a custodian. He had been holding documentation physical, not digital, pertaining to a procurement network that several interested parties would prefer remain undocumented. The documentation was not in the compound they had just left. It was in a secondary location. A safe house in the southern quarter of Herbal's older district, held by a contact who did not know the asset had been extracted and would not know until they arrived. The safe house contact would not transfer the documentation to an unknown party. He would transfer it to the asset in person and to no one else. This was the agreement they had made 11 months ago before everything went wrong, and the contact had held to it with the stubbornness of a man who understands that the only value he has in this kind of situation is the reliability of his word, which meant the asset needed to move, by ground, through a city that had been stable for several years, but that contained in its older districts the residual complexity of a place where stability is a condition that has to be maintained rather than one that exists naturally. When Stone said, 1400, Renwick said, the contact has a window. Ghost is down. I know. Stone looked at the map. The southern district was a dense grid of the streets built before vehicles were the primary consideration. Sight lines, short speeds, low, the kind of tactical picture that favored people who knew the ground and disadvantaged people who didn't. Who's running the asset? You and me, Beckett and Stover for coverage. Doctor. Calloway for the asset's medical needs. Renwick paused. He's in poor condition. He can't move fast. He needs someone capable of managing deterioration in the field if his condition changes. Stone did not look at Sarah. She's not a security element. No, Renwick said. She's not. The silence of a man absorbing a situation he does not prefer. A different silence from refusing it. 1400, Stone said. The vehicles were two nondescript SUVs, dark local plates, the kind of transport that exists in every city and disappears into traffic the way water disappears into water. The asset rode in the first vehicle with Renwick and Sarah upright in the back seat with a blanket over his shoulders for appearance rather than warmth. He had not let go of his documentation folder since Renwick had handed it back. He was looking better than at extraction, relative improvement. Less pale, more present. Sarah had gotten 2 liters of fluids into him and measured nutrition, and she was keeping her assessment running in the peripheral attention she maintained on patients monitoring his color and breathing and posture. Stone drove the second vehicle. The streets of the southern district were as narrow as the map had suggested and more densely populated than the midday hours seemed to warrant. Market activity pulled people into the streets at all hours, and the SUVs moved at the pace of surrounding traffic, slow variable punctuated by the particular chaos of urban movement in a place that hasn't fully formalized its traffic norms. Beckett was in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle watching the street geometry. Stover was in Stone's vehicle doing the same. Communication between the two vehicles ran on a closed frequency and was sparse. The situation didn't require narration. It required observation, and observation required quiet. They were 4 blocks from the safe house when the vehicle behind them turned. Not the organic, improvised turning of local drivers, a deliberate turn executed from too far back to have been responding to anything in the immediate environment. A vehicle that had been following them without following them, maintaining distance in the practiced way of people who know how to maintain it. Stone's voice on the radio, flat, precise. We've got a tail, blue pickup 3 vehicles back, paralleling us. Renwick processed this. The streets ahead narrowed at the next intersection, which reduced their options and created a potential choke point. Continue to target, eyes on the approach. The blue pickup moved. It closed the gap with the lack of subtlety that signals transition from surveillance to action, and as it closed, a second vehicle materialized from a cross street to the left. The coordination communicated planning. This had been set up in advance. Not for them specifically, necessarily. For whatever moved through this street with a certain profile at a certain hour. The people who had held the asset for 11 months were not improvising. They had anticipated that eventually something like this would happen and had pre-positioned accordingly. Not a leak, not a betrayal from within. Anticipation, the patience of people who understand that recovery operations are predictable in their general shape even when the specific details aren't. The distinction would matter in the debrief. It did not matter in the next 90 seconds. The ambush engaged at the next intersection. The blue pickup cut across the front of the lead vehicle, a blocking maneuver, not a collision. And the second vehicle came from the right, and a third that had been stationary at the curb was no longer stationary. People on the street moved with practiced efficiency, creating distance from whatever was about to happen. Renwick said 2 words and both vehicles stopped. Stone was out of the second vehicle before it finished stopping moving to cover position behind the engine block. Stover went to the opposite angle. Beckett was already outside the lead vehicle sector, covered body between the civilian population and the threat. Sarah stayed with the asset, not passively. The asset could not be in a vehicle that became a target. The vehicle needed to move. Sarah needed to be capable of moving it if Renwick couldn't. She slid into the driver's seat before she had finished deciding to the way the body moves when training and necessity arrive at the same conclusion simultaneously. Head below the window line, foot on the brake, eyes on Renwick in the side mirror. The exchange of fire was brief. The personnel in the blocking vehicles were capable, but had expected to stop the vehicles and address the occupants in a controlled sequence. What they encountered instead was a team that had already reorganized and was operating from covered positions with a clarity of response their timing didn't account for. Beckett took a round in the upper left thigh. She heard him before she saw him, the sound a person makes when they take a hit and suppress it, which is not silence, but is the closest thing to silence that pain allows. She looked left, and he was against the front wheel of the lead vehicle, one hand on his rifle maintaining his sector, the other pressed against his own leg, and the spread of blood on his trousers was moving faster than it should. She looked forward. The engagement was still active. Renwick and Stone clearing the right side, Stover on the left, fire still coming from the second blocking vehicle. She looked at the elevated structure at the far end of the street. A water tower and service structure on a rooftop 7 meters above ground level, with an angle on the remaining blocking vehicle that nothing at ground level could match. She did the mathematics. She had been doing them since Beckett went down. She got out of the vehicle, 4 steps to Beckett, crouching beside him, hands already reaching for the tourniquet pouch. "Talk to me," she said. "Through and through," he said, voice compressed with the effort of narrating facts rather than feeling them. "High thigh, bleeding fast." She looked. High thigh, medial aspect, close to the femoral, but not through it, or he wouldn't be talking in those crisp clinical syllables. 4 seconds to confirm. 10 seconds to act. Tourniquet CA applied 4 inches above the wound site, cinched to arterial occlusion. She watched his face as she cinched it, and the compression of his expression told her she'd hit the right pressure. "Hold this," she said, pressing his hand over the tourniquet handle. "Don't adjust it. Don't touch the site." "Where are you going?" he said. She was already moving. Stone had staged the Barrett in the second vehicle's cargo area before their departure, broken down in a hard case, accessible in under 40 seconds. She reached through the rear door and pulled it. The elevated structure was approximately 1,100 meters. She estimated and understood the estimation could be off by 100 meters in either direction, and the correction for that uncertainty was in the shooting, not in the calculation. She moved to the corner of a building with a partial angle on the rooftop. Not ideal partial, not clean. The midday light had removed the shadows that would have helped her read the target area's surface details. Wind in the urban corridor was irregular, deflected by building faces on either side, unreliable at the surface, and almost certainly different at elevation. She settled. Bipod on the concrete ledge at the building's corner. She breathed. Her father's voice arrived in her hands the way it always did, not heard, felt. The steadiness that was not the absence of something, but the presence of something trained and inherited and practiced, waiting in her hands through 3 years of keeping a promise. She thought of her mother's hand in the hospital chair. She thought of what she had said, "Your father gave you something beautiful." She let her heart rate drop. She found the position. A man prone on the rooftop with a weapon oriented on the ground level positions where Renwick and Stone were working. He had not identified her angle. She had a window of a few seconds before the engagement below changed something about the picture. She squeezed the trigger. 1,140 meters. The position on the roof went still. The fire from the second blocking vehicle stopped within 10 seconds as the remaining personnel recalculated a situation that had changed in a way they had not accounted for. Renwick's voice clear move. She was already moving back to Beckett in 6 steps down beside him before the echo had fully dissipated. She checked the tourniquet, the wound site, his color in his eyes, and the quality of his verbal response when she said his name. "Still here," he said. "Good. Don't stop." Renwick had the vehicles moving. Stone was at the second vehicle's door, and for the first time in the engagement, he looked at Sarah directly. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that has required him to revise his entire model of what a thing is. He said nothing. There was nothing to say that the look didn't already cover. They reached the safe house in 4 minutes. The documentation transfer took 11. The asset held himself together for the duration with the concentrated effort of a man who understands that the thing he is doing is the thing he has been kept alive to do, and that it therefore requires everything regardless of what everything is currently worth. When it was done, he sat down and his hands shook for the first time. Sarah was beside him before the shaking started. "It's all right," she said. Not comfort, information, which was what he needed. "You've done it. It's done." He looked at her, the eyes of someone who has been inside a situation for so long that the end of it doesn't feel like relief, yet it feels like the absence of a pressure the body hasn't yet registered is gone. "Yes," he said, "it is." The exfil from the safe house to the base used a different route, a different vehicle, a different configuration. But something else had changed too. The relational structure of the group had reorganized in the way teams reorganize when something has happened that rearranges the internal geometry. Something had shifted. Not everything, not all at once, but something real and permanent. The base's main transfer point was a covered staging area near the helicopter pad, and when they arrived, a vehicle was already present, a dark sedan, no markings, and a man standing beside it who was not from the base staff. Renwick saw him first and stopped. The man was in his late 40s, broad through the shoulders in the way of someone built for physical work who had not entirely stopped doing it. Dark hair gone substantially gray at the temples. In civilian clothes, but standing in them, the way military men stand in civilian clothes, the clothes a choice rather than a natural condition. He was looking at the approaching convoy with the attention of a man looking for one particular person in a group. He was looking at Sarah. Renwick stepped out of the vehicle. He stood very still for a moment, the stillness of a man whose body has responded to someone's presence before his conscious mind has finished processing who that someone is. "Commander," Renwick said. The man nodded once. "Lieutenant Commander?" A pause. "You can drop the rank. I've been out for a year." "With respect, sir," Renwick said, "some things don't retire." Frank McAllister, commander, retired, formerly commanding officer of Naval Special Warfare Group 2, the command element that had operational authority over SEAL Team 8, looked at Renwick for a moment, then looked past him. Sarah had stepped out of the vehicle. She was looking at him. McAllister had been told she would be here. He had arranged for her to be here through channels sufficiently indirect that the arrangement was not traceable to him, except by people who already knew enough to look. He had expected this moment for a year. He had prepared for it in the way people prepare for moments they know. No preparation fully addresses by acknowledging the moment is coming and letting that be enough. He had not expected to feel it the way he felt it when he saw her face. The build was different. The jawline was different. But the eyes had the quality he remembered, the focused directness he had seen in a modified storage room of an MSF facility in the Arghandab district of Kandahar in the fall of 2021. He had been on a table in that room in a condition he was later told was clinically inconsistent with survival, looking up at a headlamp clamped to a shelf and above a surgical mask, a pair of eyes that did not look afraid. He had asked afterward who she was. The MSF staff had told him. The name had meant something he could not fully process until the sedation and the post-operative state had cleared and he was thinking with a brain that was receiving adequate blood supply again. The name had meant everything. "It was you," he said. Sarah looked at him, level direct, receiving the information in his face before responding to it. "Kandahar," she said, "fall of 2021. I asked who you were. They told me your name and I had to." He stopped. He was not a man who stopped in the middle of sentences. He had briefed admirals and given eulogies and testified before congressional committees. He stopped now. "I had to sit with that for a while." "You survived the procedure," she said, "because of you." "Because the procedure worked," she said with the precision of someone who has spent years redirecting credit toward technical facts rather than accepting it herself. "You were strong enough to survive it." "The procedure was performed in a building that was on fire," he said, "by someone who had been awake for 31 hours. With equipment the MSF director later told me was not intended for thoracic surgery." He paused. "I was told you refused to evacuate until the closure was complete, and that the facility's local staff had to carry you out when the second floor gave way. The floor was structurally sound until the closure was complete," she said. Stone had moved to a position 3 meters to her right. He had been standing there since McAllister began speaking, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man receiving something that is organizing a great deal of previously disorganized information into a shape he did not anticipate and cannot yet fully name. McAllister looked at Stone. The look of two men with enough operational history between them to communicate a significant amount without language. "You know who she is," McAllister said. Stone said yes. "When did you work it out?" "Briefing room. She checked her kit the way he used to check his." McAllister was quiet for a moment. Then he looked back at Sarah. "There's something you don't know," he said, "about why your father was in that street in Fallujah." She waited. "His unit was pulling back," McAllister said. "The building had been marked clear, and it wasn't, and the fire came from the second floor, and the pullback order had been given. Two men were not going to make it to cover before that position opened up on them. He chose the next words carefully, the way you choose words when they are the last accurate record of something. One of those men was a lieutenant on his first combat deployment, a junior officer who had made a bad call on the approach and put himself out of position." He stopped. "That was me. I was 30 years old and I had made a mistake that was going to get me killed, and your father saw what I had done and where I was, and he moved toward it." The staging area was quiet around them. The bass sounds continued in a different context entirely. "He didn't know me," McAllister said. "I was attached from a different element. We had been in country together less than 2 weeks. He had no particular reason to move toward that position rather than toward cover. He moved anyway because that is," he stopped again, "because that is what he was, what he decided to be in the time it takes to make a decision." Sarah looked at him. "He saved you," she said. "Yes. And 17 years later, his daughter saved you again." McAllister held her gaze. "Yes." The weight of this sat between them in the way of things that have no resolution, not because they are unresolved, but because resolution is not what they need. What they need is acknowledgement, that certain things connect across time in ways no one designs and no one controls. That decisions made in the seconds of one life carry forward into the seconds of other lives in ways that are not fully visible until long after the decision has been made. Renwick was watching this. Beckett was leaning against the second vehicle, leg splinted, watching this. Stover was watching with the expression of someone absorbing something they will spend years thinking about. Stone had not moved. He was looking at the ground near his boots, moving through it the way he moved through everything completely, however long that required. Then he reached into the left chest pocket of his jacket. He removed something small. A piece of paper folded multiple times, creased along the folds in the way of something carried rather than stored, handled regularly over a long period of time, not kept in a drawer, but kept on him, which is a different relationship with a piece of paper entirely. He extended it towards Sarah without explanation. The gesture had the quality of something rehearsed, not in practice, but in the mind, over many years of considering whether and when to do it. She took it and unfolded it along its original creases. It was a bank transfer record, routing number, an account number, the standard format of an automatic monthly transfer printed on paper, yellowed slightly at the edges. The account number was one she knew. She had seen it in her mother's files after her mother died, going through the paperwork with the focused attention of grief that turns itself into administrative tasks because administrative tasks are something you can finish. She had found the record of the recurring monthly deposits, 16 years of them, and she had traced the source routing number for 2 weeks before the trail ended at a holding account with no name attached. She had been certain for a year. She was looking at the confirmation. She refolded the paper along its original creases and placed it in the chest pocket of her own jacket. She looked at Stone. He was doing it directly for the first time without the mediation of distance or the professional indirection of a man who observes everything and credits himself with nothing. 16 years, she said. Yes. She never knew who it was from. No. She would have wanted to thank you. Something moved across his face, brief, controlled, and the most unguarded thing she had seen from him. She already did, he said. She wrote me, twice. Thanked me for being there, for pulling him out. She never knew about the account. He stopped. But she thanked me for the other thing, and that was enough. She looked at him for a long moment. He saved you once, she said. You carried him home when he fell. You took care of us for 16 years. A pause. That's not a debt, Stone. That's what people do for each other when they decide to. His jaw worked. His hands at his sides opened and closed once. He would have done the same, he said. I know, she said. That's why I'm not surprised you did. McAllister had been watching in silence. He looked at Renwick, then back at Sarah. Dr. Calloway, he said, I'm not here only because of Kandahar. I'm here because Naval Special Warfare Command has a question for you, and because I asked to be the one to ask it." She waited. "There's a gap in how we train and deploy medical capability in special operations," he said. "It has been there for a long time. People have identified it. Nobody has built the solution." He paused. "What you did in the past 36 hours, the compound, the street, that is not a gap. That is a model. And the question is whether you want to be the person who builds the curriculum." She was quiet. "I'm still in residency." "You'd finish your residency. This would be concurrent a development role, designing integration training for special operations medical personnel, teaching people to do what you do. Both things. The hands that hold the scalpel and the hands that hold the rifle." She looked at Beckett, leaning against the vehicle. He had been listening with the attention of a man who has been saved twice in 30 hours, and therefore has a vested interest in the outcome. He met her eyes. "She saved my life," he said. "Twice. If that's the argument for whatever you're asking her, consider it made." Stover looked at her, 24 years old, with the expression of someone watching something happen that they are going to describe for the rest of their lives. Stone said nothing. He looked at the ground. Then he looked up and nodded a single, slow, deliberate nod, carrying the full weight of the person giving it. Sarah looked at McAllister. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded. "That's all I'm asking." She looked at Renwick. He said nothing. His expression said what it needed to. The decision was hers, and the team's assessment of the decision's merits was not something she needed to wonder about. She looked at the sky above Herbal. Flat blue of midday, cloudless, the kind of sky that gives you nothing to look at and everything to think under. She thought about her father, the bench behind the house, the cedar planks, the sawhorses, the smell of the field in autumn. Steady hands, Sarah, both of them. She thought about her mother's hand in the hospital chair. "Your father gave you something beautiful." She thought about what she had told Stone. I wanted to know what it meant. She was beginning to understand. 5 months later, the Naval Medical Center in San Diego sat in the morning light, doing what it always did, functioning unglamorous, doing the work it was built to do, with the unadorned persistence of institutions that know their purpose well enough not to announce it. The classroom was on the second floor. Not large space for 20, currently occupied by 16. The full enrollment of the inaugural class of the Integrated Combat Medicine course. Navy corpsmen ranging in age from 22 to 31, with the quality of people who have already proven something and are present because they want to prove something more. Sarah stood at the front with a marker in her hand. The whiteboard behind her carried 2 lines she had written before the students arrived: "Heal when you can. Fight when you must." She let them read it. Let them sit with it for the specific amount of time it takes for something to move from the eyes to the place where things land. "These 2 things are not a choice," she said. "They are a sequence. The sequence depends on context, and reading context correctly is a skill, and skills are built through practice, not through understanding. This course is practice. Everything else is preparation for practice." 16 faces. None of them certain yet of exactly what they had signed up for. All of them certain it was worth signing up for. She recognized this. She had felt it herself. In the first row, Colt Stover sat with his notebook open and his pen ready. He had submitted his request to attend within 48 hours of returning to Coronado. He had not given an explanation. The command element had not asked for one. The program had moved faster than anyone anticipated. What McAllister had framed as a development role had become something more structural in the 5 months since Herbal. Naval Special Warfare Command had formally adopted the curriculum framework in September. The VA had submitted a request to expand it into 3 additional states the following year. Not the combat medicine components specifically, but the integration methodology, the framework for training medical personnel to operate across contexts rather than within a single defined role. A phrase had begun circulating in the training channels passed between corpsmen and combat medics in the shorthand that practical people use for things that matter: drag them out alive. She had not said it first. She was fairly certain Beckett had said it to Stover during a training evolution in October, in the tone of someone passing on something they consider obvious. But it had moved. The way things move when they fit the shape of something people have been trying to say and haven't found the words for. She had heard it from a student the previous week and had said nothing. She had written it on the whiteboard that morning. Below the 2 lines, 16 notebooks filling with the morning's first block. Trauma assessment under fire. The cognitive architecture required to evaluate a patient while simultaneously evaluating the environment. She worked through it with the economy of someone who has run this material Enough times that the words come in the right order, without effort, and the students engage with the focused attention of people who understand that what they are learning is not theoretical. At 1100 hours, she dismissed them for a break. She stood alone in the classroom. She looked at what she had written on the board, the two lines at the top, the framework below, the beginning of something that had not existed before and would continue to exist after this particular morning was over. She took her phone from her jacket pocket. She had this habit not daily but regularly of pulling up the contact and looking at it. The name in her phone was Dad. She had never changed it because changing it would have required a decision about what to change it to, and she had not been able to make that decision. She pressed call. The line rang. It always rang. She waited through the rings the way she always waited, not in expectation, but in the ritual of it, which was what it was at this point. The ritual of connection that does not require the other person to be present, to be real. The voicemail picked up. She had heard the message enough times she didn't need to listen. She listened anyway. Her father's voice recorded sometime in the late 90s on a machine that had compressed the warmth out of it, slightly but not entirely. "This is Bill Calloway. Leave a message and I'll get back to you." She held the phone to her ear for a moment after the beep. "It's me," she said. Then, "I think I'm doing the thing you would have told me to do. I can't be certain, but I think so." A pause. "Steady hands, Dad. I'm working on both of them." She ended the call. She looked at the whiteboard for another moment. Then she took the eraser and cleared the right half of the board, leaving the two lines she had written, and she began to write the second block's framework in her clean, precise handwriting, the handwriting of someone who has spent years writing on small surfaces under difficult conditions and developed the discipline of clarity out of functional necessity. The door opened at 11:40. She heard it didn't look up from the board. "Briefing at 0800 tomorrow." Ghost stood in the doorway in civilian clothes, his left shoulder carrying the slight asymmetry that surgeries leave behind his voice, as unhurried as it had always been. He looked better than he had at Herbal. He looked like a man who had decided something during recovery and arrived at the decision without drama. She turned. "Renwick's mission," she said. Ghost shook his head once. "Renwick's asking, but it's your call." She looked at him for a moment. "What's the package?" "Full medical embed," he said. "Tier 1 element, extended duration. They want someone who can run the medical architecture for the whole operation, not just respond to casualties." She turned back to the whiteboard. She looked at what she had written, the two lines at the top, the framework below, the beginning of something that had not existed before and would continue to exist after this particular morning was over. 16 students who would carry what they learned here into situations she would not be present for, doing things she had not done for them, but had given them the tools to do. She thought about her father's voice on the recording. She thought about Stone's hands opening and closing once the day she told him it wasn't a debt. She thought about what McAllister had said the first day of this, the hands that hold the scalpel and the hands that hold the rifle. Both hands. Her father's instruction offered across the distance of nearly 2 decades, unchanged by time. She set the marker on the whiteboard ledge. "Tell Renwick 0800, she said. "I'll be there." Ghost nodded. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer, looking at the two lines at the top of the whiteboard with an expression she had learned over the past 5 months to associate with something genuine, not performed, not diplomatic, but the specific quality of a man who has revised his understanding of something and is at peace with the revision. He left. She turned back to the whiteboard. She picked up the marker. She continued. Outside the window, San Diego was doing what it always did in early autumn, the light coming off the bay in the way of coastal light, clear and flat, touching everything without hiding anything. Somewhere on the base at Coronado, a new class of candidates was in the water, learning the first of the many things the water has to teach about what a person is made of. Somewhere in an older district of a city 14 time zones away, a street was ordinary again, carrying its pedestrians and its vehicles, without memory of what had moved through it 5 months before. In 16 notebooks on the second floor of the Naval Medical Center, the morning's instruction was recorded in 16 different handwriting styles, all of them carrying the same information. All of them the beginning of something that would continue long after the hands that set it in motion had moved on to other work. This is what her father had taught her. Not just the shooting, not just the steadiness of the hands. He had taught her that the things you pass on are the things that matter, that the shot you take is for the moment in front of you, but the knowledge you give is for every moment after it. That the real inheritance is not the skill itself, but the willingness to carry it forward into places where it is needed to hold it steady through everything that tries to shake it loose, and then to put it in the hands of the person standing next to you and trust them to do the same. She had been doing that for 5 months. She intended to continue. There would be a briefing at 0800. There would be a mission. There would be a team that did not yet know her and would have to learn, as every team learns through the accumulated evidence of shared difficulty, the only school that issues this particular credential. She would hold the knife steady, both hands, she always had,